Well, welcome everybody to our Exodus Leader videos. We're glad to be with you. I'm Carolyn Jones.
I'm Trey Corey, and we're grateful to have another semester and another study to get to jump into.
Yeah, so good. So before we get started, we thought we might just set you leaders up with a little bit of an approach to the book of Exodus, and maybe how you can think about it as you go forward.
Clearly, for a lot of our Bible studies here at Grace, we do a lot of epistles. And so even for myself, just thinking through jumping into Exodus, which is going to be narrative, is just different. And so it being a different genre, it's going to kind of require a different approach. And it's going to be a bit of a different feel this semester. I was thinking even just about my own experience. And whenever I'm in an epistle, I feel like if it were basketball, like I'm dribbling with my dominant hand. And then if we get into genre, to be perfectly honest with you, even the Gospels, I feel like I'm dribbling with my offhand, where I'm just not as comfortable in narrative. And so part of what we want to do this semester, since narrative is 40% of the Old Testament, it's 60% of the New Testament, we've got to be able to handle both kinds of genre. And so with a different kind of genre, it's going to require a different kind of approach. And even if you've been in a lot of our studies before, a lot of the skills that you're used to, that you've seen from us, we're going to have in there. We're going to talk about context. We're going to talk about word study. We're going to talk about a lot of those kind of different kinds of things you're used to seeing. But we're also going to hit a lot of literary narrative-based skills. And so I was joking around with Carolyn even earlier today I think there's somewhere in my middle school experience in English, I've kind of buried some of these literature things that maybe I just had a bad year or I just didn't like middle school. And so we're going to take you guys all the way back to that space this semester, because we're going to talk about setting. We're going to talk about tracing the plot. We're going to talk about characters and dialogue and point of view and even irony. And so a lot of these kind of literary pieces are going to be really vital and important. And so if you're really not sure kind of in terms of how to handle a story and kind of what to do, we want to kind of assure you we're going to slow down. We're going to have a lot of skills that you're not used to in our studies, but they're going to be really, really helpful to kind of break it down and kind of give you the little sense of how to navigate in the story. Because honestly, I think for so many years, I would open the biblical text and get into narrative, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, and just think, well, that's a great story, but I don't really know what to do with it. I don't know what the takeaways need to be. I'm not really sure necessarily even how to study it. And so what we want to do this semester is not just teach you guys Exodus, but really want to kind of help guide you guys through as to how do you study narrative? What do you do with narrative?
Yeah, so good. And the second way that we would encourage you to approach the study of Exodus is really, again, what we say with most of our studies is that we want to approach them as an encounter with God, a relational encounter. God's word is living and active. And so as we approach it, we're not thinking about mastering the content. We don't have to remember every detail about this long epic history, but as if we're in a history class even. But what we want to do is look at it as a theological history, as a story about God and his people. And in this epic story, which becomes just the iconic story for the people of Israel, and has links all the way through the rest of the Bible, even into the New Testament, into the writings of Paul, we want to say that this is the story of rescue and formation. So God is rescuing his people out of slavery, and he's forming them into his chosen people. And he does that through his presence, and he does that through his instruction on how to live practically. And so what we've done in this study is actually taken that idea of formation, like how God is shaping a people who were very deformed at the beginning of the story, and move them toward becoming more like him and more like his chosen people. And so we've embedded in the lessons some spiritual practices, because as believers, we're on a journey as well. We've been rescued out of sin and death, and we are walking with and following Jesus into Christ likeness. And so we have some spiritual practices that we are going to highlight. So prayer. We're going to talk about prayer in 3 different ways. We're going to do a practice of journaling and reflecting, because a lot of what God is calling his people to do is remember. Remember what I have done for you. Remember my promises. He introduces Sabbath for the first time in the book of Exodus. So what does it look like to Sabbath? What does it look like for us to Sabbath? Service. How do we serve one another and serve God? And then reflection and confession, because the people of Israel have a massive failure in this book as well. And so how do they confess and come back into relationship with God? Some of our tools you'll recognize. Our Every Neighbor map is in here, starting a spiritual conversation. So in this study, we've woven some of the familiar and some of the new, and we hope that it'll be a great semester for all of us.
Even as you see some of these kind of new elements, whether it's these spiritual formation pieces or some of the literary skills, it's really a study just like any of our other studies. That at its overarching level, what we're hoping that will happen in the course of this semester in your group is that it's going to be a place that people can connect with the Lord, connect with one another, that they can grow in the Word, and ultimately that they can engage the world. And so really, a lot of these pieces that we're trying to bake in are really trying to help set you up as a group leader to be able to make an environment and facilitate an environment for all of those pieces to occur. To not just be growing in the Word and knowing a story and knowing the truths of it, but ultimately to be able to connect within a community as you learn that story and kind of are changed by it as well, and have the opportunity ultimately to be changed internally and ultimately to impact the world that we're a part of. And so you're going to see in our study as we talk about connect, grow, and engage that those overarching values are really why we've baked these pieces in the way we have to really hopefully round out what the group's experience can be as we walk through Exodus this semester.
Yeah. And so as we jump into lesson 1, which is the survey and Exodus chapter 1, just want to quickly remind you that we do have a group discussion guide that's in every single lesson. So for this lesson, it's on page 18, and it is organized around those 3 values Trey just mentioned: connect, grow, and engage. So look at those before you get to this week's lesson. And it's really just suggestions. Some of you may want to do some of these pieces. Other times you may have a better idea, which is great, but we want to give you some things to help you get started. So during your connect time, one of the main goals is to get people talking. So we know that when people feel comfortable, when they feel like they belong, if they get to share and they're not just passively sitting and listening. So always be careful, especially in the first few weeks of a study, to try and make sure that everyone has a chance to share and talk. So use that connect time mainly for that. And then as we hit the growth section, what do you have, Trey?
Yeah, so I think as we jump into Exodus, and thinking about the story, one of the things we're going to try to do in this first kind of video for you guys in your first meeting is we want to have the opportunity for your group to survey the book. And so as we survey the book, hopefully they've had a chance to kind of read through the whole thing. But again, we kind of want to give people a sense of the whole before we kind of break it down into parts. And so what survey is just an overview. It's looking at the whole of the book and kind of from the background to who wrote it, when they wrote it, where they wrote it, what was going on, the meaning, the purpose behind the book, why was it written, what are the big themes and truths behind it. And so what we want to do in this first kind of lesson in the study is to begin to survey the book to get people into it. Maybe they've read it all. Maybe they're going to kind of have their first experience ever with it on the first night that we're in it, and that's fine. And so what we want to do is just get a minute. And as Carolyn said, sometimes even as we jump in and have them read chapter 1, even just kind of farming out the passage to let them read sections of it just gets their mouth moving and something that's not intimidating, hopefully, as opposed to answering a theological question. One of the things that we loved and one of the things that we would encourage is you think about Exodus as a narrative. In some ways, we recognize this is the holy word of God, that it's not like any other story. But in some other ways, we would argue that it is just like any other story, that it is story. And there are elements and components of any story that we see, whether in TV or in movie or what we're going to see here throughout the semester in the book of Exodus. And so one of the great icebreaker questions is if Exodus is kind of an iconic, epic story that is maybe one of the most significant in all of the Old Testament, then asking people, what are their favorite movies? What are their favorite TV shows? What are their most favorite iconic stories and why do they love them? And so it can be a nice icebreaker question. getting people thinking about TV shows, movies, or just stories in general, but it also kind of gives you a little insight into, well, why do they love that story? What does it say about them? And again, it's not intimidating. It's an easy kind of icebreaker to get them moving, to get them talking, and get them sharing a little bit.
Yeah, so good. All right, so as we hit page 12, going over some of the historical background, we've given a section here where we're talking about the book of Exodus is really Act 2 of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So fill us in a little bit more, Trey.
Yeah, you bet. So what we've tried to do here in page 12 is kind of give you a recap. So if Exodus is Acts 2 and it's opening, and we were given a recap, like this was in episode 2 that started off with a recap of episode 1. Well, what happened in the first episode? What happened in Act 1 that we need to make sure that we were aware of, because this story is continuing from the book of Genesis over the next first 5 books of our Old Testament. And so as Exodus opens, what we're trying to remind everyone is what was the stage that was set in the book of Genesis. Particularly what we're really trying to highlight is that not just that God created humanity, but humanity fell into sin. And because humanity fell into sin, there were consequences and separation with God and between God and humanity. And what God begins to do with a man named Abraham and his family and his descendants is to create a redemptive plan that he puts in motion. That's going to be incredibly vital to the book of Exodus, the rest of the Old Testament, and ultimately even into the New Testament. And specifically what we're trying to highlight in question 1, looking at Genesis 11, 13, and 15, is that God chooses a pagan man who was not even initially obedient to him, was often resistant to him, and he chooses this man that he's going to make a series of promises to him and his descendants. Particularly what he promised Abraham in Genesis 11, 12, and 15 was that he would provide Abraham and his descendants a land with specific dimensions and borders, that he promised him a seed that his descendants would number as the stars of the skies, and then ultimately that he would bless Abraham. He would bless him personally, that he would make his name great. He also said that your descendants will be so great that I will make a nation out of you, and that nation will be great. And then lastly, that ultimately through him and through his family, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That blessing that God wanted to bestow upon Abraham was personal, it was national, and then ultimately it was universal. That God was going to do something through Abraham and his descendants that would be ultimately a blessing to the entirety of the earth. The problem is, as the book of Genesis ends, and as Joseph, the grandson of Abraham, dies, he's promising and he's affirming to his descendants that God is going to fulfill his promises to the nation of Israel, that he's going to ultimately bring them to the land that he had promised Abraham. But as Genesis ends and as we get into Exodus, what we find is that this family Joseph had taken the family to Egypt, and they were about 70, but now with Joseph's death, they're about 2 million people. And they've grown so large as we jump into the story of Exodus, and we're going to see they're going to be into slavery, they're going to be oppressed, and nothing circumstantially is unfolding like it seemed like it would when Genesis ended. So the question becomes, what is God doing? Where is God in the midst of this? Will God fulfill his promises, or has God made promises that he isn't strong enough to fulfill or doesn't have a plan to fulfill? And so the story of Exodus is going to walk us through how is God going to bring fulfillment to those covenant promises that he gave Abraham in Genesis. How is he going to work that out through Abraham's descendants and through the nation of Israel in the midst of incredibly difficult circumstances?
So good, so good. And so as we look to the next page in the lesson, we see again a reminder of the narrative aspect of this and why narrative is important. And you'll see kind of halfway down the page, the instruction there is to skim through and read the book of Exodus, or even just look at the headings of the paragraphs. So as you approach this section, as you're leading it with your group, you'll have to know your group, whether they actually did that or not, or if that's something that you actually kind of need to do together. A lot of people have familiarity with the book of Exodus. It is an iconic story. I mean, think of there's movies about it, and people may know some of the story. So use your best judgment on how you might want to walk through this. But we wanted to point out that these 6 questions that you see here on these 2 pages, page 13 and 14, are actually the basic questions that we ask of any story. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And these 6 questions are going to be repeated in the upcoming lessons. And what we've done is we've inserted them in every other lesson. So as we look at a big chunk of the narrative, some of the time we're going to be asking these 6 questions, and then the next week we're going to be looking more at the plot and having people write out sort of a plot summary. So these questions are going to be coming back up, but here in this first lesson is sort of an introduction about how you can use them to look at the whole book of Exodus. So some of these are going to be easy to go over, and the who is the story about, the main characters, and then what are some of the, in question 2 there, we think it might be fun to ask, what are some of the big events that you know are in the book of Exodus? Because there's some big ones: the burning bush, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, the giving of the 10 commandments at Mount Sinai, the golden calf rebellion. It would be another great time to get people talking, to get people just remembering what the main story is about.
One of the other things that would be easy to do is if you're trying to skim through the book, instead of having everyone skim all of the book, you can divide your group up into pairs and have them take 5 chapter chunks. And so they kind of give a quick kind of, hey, here are the big ideas or big events we saw in these 5 chapters. And then the next pair kind of goes through the next 5 chapters. So you can kind of carve it up. Again, you're trying to get engagement, trying to get everybody kind of roll their sleeves up and jump in. Because if the whole feels overwhelming, well, then break it up.
Yeah.
Let pairings take different sections to kind of feel like it's more bite-sizable and more obtainable. One of in the midst of these questions, we really like question 2. So whether it's the big events, that's kind of the easy way to enter into it. And then after you kind of get to the big events, then it's, well, what are the big ideas connected to those events? One of the things I like about narratives is sometimes your themes are attached to the tensions that exist. So what are the tensions that you feel in the story? What are the things that kind of elicit something in you that kind of create a reaction in you? There's probably something about the purpose or the big point of the story attached to whatever it's creating in you. And so getting people to kind of sort through what are those big ideas. And so for us, God's authority or sovereignty over even human authorities was an idea we saw. God's redemption or rescue of his people out of slavery is an easy one to see. And so you kind of get into those spaces and you can kind of keep building from there out on some of those. One of my favorite questions was question 6 in terms of how does this story affect you? Because often epistles and kind of getting into Paul's logical flow of the letter doesn't elicit as much in us as a story does. And so I'm curious, Carolyn, as you kind of jumped in, what were some of the things that stood out for you about how Exodus impacted you?
Yeah, I think that, again, as Trey has said, that putting yourself in the shoes of the characters themselves, I think is a great way to get into this part of how it affects you. So as I think about myself being, in Moses's family. So a lot of the story is about Moses and his family, his brother, his sister, his mother, his wife, his father-in-law. Moses' family is pretty big in that. So some of the points of view within the dynamics of Moses's family and how he interacts and how they interact with him, how God uses different people in his family to bring about what he wants to have happen. And I think another thing that I was thinking about with this story that I hadn't really thought about before was just the trauma and the suffering of the Israelites for those many long years should inform how I think about how they respond in the wilderness as they're learning to follow God. I've sort of judged them in the past. And yet for my own self, I don't want to be judged as I'm coming out of a hard trial, to perform to a certain level. So there's a lot of ways that we can see how we can put ourselves in the story that will help us as we apply and interpret the story.
Obviously, Moses is the central figure of the story. And I think as we think about the theme of leadership, Moses is a really interesting case study. Often when I think of the most epic leaders, they seem courageous, daring, bold, never hesitant, never fearful. And then we get to Exodus and we see something really different in terms of a leader's profile. And so not just a flawed hero in some ways, but a particularly at times insecure and hesitant one. And so it's really fascinating to see when God's patient with some of his hesitations and when he's really impatient with some of his failures. And so watching the Lord navigate with this particular chosen leader who seems to have a different makeup than some of the leaders that we've lofted maybe sometimes in our head, to me is a fascinating kind of case study as we walk through the book.
Yeah, so good. So tracing the plot is part of a really good students surveying of a book. And so we've sort of given you, there's many ways to divide the book of Exodus, but one that we found that was helpful was sort of this 3-part way that the plot goes. And so chapters 1 through 18 is basically the story of God's rescuing Israel from their Egyptian bondage. 19 through 24 is where he institutes the covenant with them. And so he gives them Torah. He's defining them by this covenant. And then in 25 through 40, he's instructing them on how to build this tabernacle, but it's for the purpose of him inhabiting it. And so his presence goes among them. So some words that you could think about are delivering, defining, and dwelling. You could think about redemption, covenant, and presence. You had a couple of those.
Yeah, I thought about rescue, reform, and relate. You know, so even giving your group a chance to kind of go, if you were to kind of break this story down into sections and kind of categorize them, what words would you use? How would you kind of summarize the flow? And so what we did here in the opening lesson is kind of give you a way to conceptually think about the book and its movements. The other way you can kind of do it to me is visually, that most movies, most TV shows will start with a problem. That problem and its tension rises as the episode or as the movie goes along. And you begin to wonder, can this ever be resolved? Is this just headed toward doom? It's a nuclear terrorist threat and it seems like there's no hope. And then all of a sudden the hero emerges and he solves the problem. And then the tension plateaus before all the issues are worked out and the tension subsides. And so most stories kind of have this. We start from a problem and we build in tension, the solution, the hero solves it, and then it kind of trails back off as it reaches resolution, which is kind of the opposite of most Aggie football seasons. They start high and there's no tension and then it just collapses. That most movies and stories start low, work toward a tension that is going to lead to a happy ever ending. And so for us, I think we see that in Exodus. We're going to see the slavery. We're going to see the tension rising. Will God's people ever escape out of this situation? Will God do anything to intervene? And so we see this man, Moses, who emerges, who's a flawed hero, who seems like this is who God's chosen, and how is he going to do anything that's helpful for them? But eventually that leader emerges, and eventually he steps forward with a partner as well. And then we're going to see God rescue Israel out of that. We're going to see a plateau of that tension and tragedy. And then ultimately we're going to see a resolution as God not just rescues them, but then in a sense begins to reform them and transform them to be what he wants them to be.
So good. So another thing that's interesting about this book is that while it covers in total a span of 400 years of history, in actuality, the bulk of the chapters really focus on just 2 years of that history. So it's a fascinating zoom in focus on these 2 years, critical years. So many big things happen in the story of Israel.
And so the Passover, and in a sense, Israel's exodus out of Egypt, become probably the seminal event of the Old Testament that provides a great type or a great parallel for what we're going to see in the New Testament of Jesus' crucifixion and then his resurrection. That there's probably no other event that will match the Exodus in the Old Testament until we get to Christ's resurrection in the New Testament.
Yeah. And so then that brings you to actually all of chapter 1 that we've printed out here in the packet. And there's a couple ways that you could discuss this. We have some 4 questions that you can go over. You could have somebody several people read through it. That's probably a good idea to do, again, to get people talking, but again, to refresh their memory about exactly what is happening at the beginning of this story. And then going over the questions about character, setting, and then the significance of Joseph's words at the end of the last. So depending on what you've talked about before, you can kind of negotiate this section of the lesson. But one of the questions that we really thought it would be significant to talk about is actually question 4 there. The remarkable midwives and what a contrast they are to Pharaoh. So as you discuss this section and this chapter, I think that would be a great thing to focus on.
Yeah. One of the threads we've seen through some of this too is interesting as you walk through the story of Exodus, and you mentioned this earlier, is who gets named and who is unnamed. So we are doing a lot of historical work to figure out exactly which Pharaoh was the character in the book of Exodus, because he's not actually named. And so his actions are such that he's not worthy to be remembered. But meanwhile, the midwives are going to act so courageously that they are going to be named, because their actions stand out not only as a contrast to Pharaoh, those who are trying to preserve life versus those who are trying to take it, but they're also going to be preserved in terms of their name and notoriety throughout history. So
yeah, so good. One thing I noticed about the midwives and Pharaoh, the contrast was who they feared. So the midwives feared God. It says specifically in the text, but you can see by the actions of the Pharaoh that he actually feared men. He feared the sons of Israel, but what he feared mostly underneath that was his loss of control. He feared that they would grow so great in number that they would align with his enemies, and that his kingdom, he feared for his own kingdom and his own self-preservation more than he cared for life or the ultimate true God. So who are you trusting? Who are you fearing? Are some of the big questions that can come out of that one.
One of the big literary kind of skills we'll talk about is irony. And so chapter 1 kind of shows you all of Pharaoh's fears. And as you do an overview of the book, you know where the story is going to end. And so he feared that this people was going to be too numerous, so they would eventually plunder his nation. But because of his actions, he's going to set things on a course in which they will plunder his nation. And so you see this irony of all the steps he's taking to avoid a fear, which ends up just bringing about fulfillment to the fear that he wanted to avoid, that we kind of see named so clearly in chapter 1 as we kind of jump into the overview of chapter 1 specifically. One of the questions we think is really helpful for you guys as you kind of move beyond just an overview of the whole book and move beyond just looking at chapter 1 is on the last page, kind of this reflection section. And we asked one of the questions, what are you hoping to gain from studying the book of Exodus? That somewhere along the way in your first night, I think it's really helpful to ask a question that gets a little bit deeper as to just, hey, what are people's expectations? Why do they sign up to jump into this group? Why do they want to study Exodus? And so maybe it's something about Exodus. Maybe it's something about finding community that they've not been able to find. Maybe it's about something that's going on that's really hard in life, and they've come to find a place of hope to get kind of involved in a church. And so don't skip over that question. We think in the first night, it's a really helpful one to kind of just gauge a little bit of where are people spiritually, what are they looking for, without kind of having to be like, give me your testimony and your whole spiritual life story, but kind of getting a quick gauge on, hey, why are they here? Or why do they want to jump into this? What might be driving them as they start out a new semester?
Yeah, and the second question there kind of relates to chapter 1. It's a little bit of a softball to get people to say, you know, what resonated with you from this chapter, which is something that we ask, you know, as the Lord pushes his finger on things about his word, specifically to us individually. And then by talking about it in the group, it again sparks the fire of what God may be doing in all of our hearts as we encounter his word. And then that leads us into praying for one another. So what is God pushing and exposing in us through his word? And then let's pray about that together. So this first practice is actually about how we can pray together for each other in our group. So this may be a group that has been meeting for a while, or it may be a brand new group. And so it's always good in the early weeks to talk about that, because supporting and caring for one another through praying together is a vital piece of our discipleship. So
I encourage you to. You're going to create you're going to facilitate an environment where that's possible, but recognize there could be some people who are so unsure they may not be ready to kind of share things that are personal. And definitely there may be some who aren't really wanting to pray publicly in a group setting. So just be sensitive of you're creating opportunity and a space to step forward, but don't push people beyond maybe what they're ready for, because so kind of gauge that as you navigate that. But we're excited for you guys as you lead this semester through the book of Exodus. We think it's one of the most epic stories that is iconic in nature. And so the things we're going to pull out, the things we're going to see, and the conversations that we're going to have, the opportunity your group's going to have over the course of this semester, we think are huge.
Yeah. So good. That's all we have for you today. We're praying for you guys.
See y'all next week.